We are now moving on to health and healing in the Buddhist tradition, and this religious tradition has been connected with healing from its very beginning. And Buddhism around the world has been involved with a wide variety of healing practices. We're going to be looking at some examples as we move through. And this includes within the hospice movement, working as practitioners, as healers, as doctors, as herbologists, and as psychologists. And we'll be looking at some of the techniques as well. So the Buddhist tradition emerged out of the larger Indian tradition in the 6th century CE, so there are definite similarities between Buddhism and Hinduism. And however, the difference being that Buddhism became an international religion as it moved across Asia, and then it's moved also into the West. So it's also important to understand that there are different denominations within Buddhism and they take a different approach. And so the three main divisions are Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And Theravada is the tradition that's most common in Southeast Asia, so places like Thailand. And Mahayana went into China and all the nations kind of in China's orbit, so Vietnam and Korea. So even though it has these differences, there are key points in common, and probably central to this is the Buddhist principle of compassion. And so I think you can see the logical outgrowth of healing practices out of a principle of compassion. So I'm going to move on to looking at the early tradition, the Buddha himself, and some of the key ideas coming out of that earliest strata of the tradition. I want to talk a little bit about what we know about the Buddha prior to him becoming enlightened. So the Buddha is actually a title. It means the awakened one. And prior to that, his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was an aristocratic of an aristocratic caste, so he was a kshatriya in the area between northern India and what is now Nepal. And so he was raised very typically for a person of his caste and class, and so he was trained in martial arts, he was educated in Sanskrit, and he was living the life of a prince, essentially. And so this is taken from what are believed to be his actual words talking about himself. He says, "I was delicate, most delicate. Lily pools were made for me at my father's house, solely for my benefit. I had 3 palaces, one for winter, one for summer, and one for the rains." So we can see very clearly this very wealthy person. He's somebody living in luxury, and the early story of his life talks about he eventually marries, has a son, and we hear about his luxurious life. He has a harem, and he has everything he could possibly want. To the legends around Siddhartha Gautama, he was being kept from any kind of trouble or suffering by his father because there had been a dream that his mother had about him that he might become a spiritual leader, and his father didn't want that, and he wanted him to become a political leader. And so the story goes that he was kept away from suffering, and the logic seems to be that suffering leads us to religion. And so we're told that by around the age of 30, as I said, he's living this life of luxury, but he decides to go out with his charioteer, who's also his cousin, and he sees the 4 sights, and this is a very important part of the biography of Siddhartha Gautama. So according to the story, the first sight when he's out with his charioteer is a sick man. So he sees a sick man walking along, and having been so protected, he says to his charioteer, what is that? And he's told that the man is ill, and Siddhartha Gautama says, "Will that happen to me?" And his cousin is forced to say, yes, that could happen. No one can control that. That can happen to anybody. The second sight on another trip is an old man. So he sees somebody in very frail health, and the same question is asked, could that happen to me? And the charioteer says, yes, old age comes to every human being, regardless of their wealth or status. The third sight, on his third journey, he sees a corpse, so he sees a dead body, and he again says, will this happen to me? Will death happen to me? And the charioteer says, yes, death comes to all people. And Siddhartha Gautama is absolutely shocked and appalled. And then the fourth sight, on the next trip, he sees a monk. So he sees somebody who has renounced the world, and he's very struck by how calm that person seems, their equanimity. So what we're being taught in this story of the four sights is sort of the slings and arrows that are there for every human being. And so Siddhartha Gautama becomes aware that all of these things could happen to him and will happen to him. And so this causes him to go into a kind of existential crisis when he realizes that he's subject to these, to sickness, old age, and death. The story, as a result of overcoming the illusion that he's not subject to these forces, such as sickness and old age, the Buddha decides to renounce the world. And so there is an extremely ascetic strand within Buddhism, that idea that you can only reach enlightenment if you give up the things of the world, which includes family, it includes wealth, it includes property. And so there's many kind of myths about him leaving. I'm going to keep it fairly simple here, but according to the story, he leaves the palace in the middle of the night, and he's on horseback, he dismounts, and he cuts all of his hair off with a sword. So you probably know that in many monastic traditions, it's very common to cut off the hair, sometimes to shave the whole head. So he cuts off all his hair, he gives away all his possessions and his clothing, and he becomes a renunciant. And in typical Indian tradition, he goes looking for a guru, for a spiritual teacher. So according to the tradition, he studies with a number of different spiritual gurus, and they teach him techniques that we would now recognize as yoga. He learns about meditation and so on. But according to the scripture, he surpasses all of his teachers. So he's clearly a prodigy. And so he sets out on his own because he's already gained all the knowledge he can from a teacher. The graph is of an image, a sculpture of the Buddha in the Gandhara style, so North Indian style. And so you see a lot of the hallmarks of Buddhist iconography here. He's in a meditative pose. And obviously this style varies across the Buddhist world. If you see a Thai statue, it's going to look different in style, but nonetheless, it's very important that you look at the mudras, the hand gestures. This is actually a teaching mudra. So the mudra establishes what part of the biography or what part of the story we're in. But I just wanted you to have a sense of the images, the earliest images of the Buddha here, and he's shown in a meditative posture. And so the story goes that he leaves his teachers and he goes off alone, and he undergoes a series of very strenuous fasts. And so fasting is a very common part of ascetic traditions. And so we're told that he fasts almost to death, and then he's given food by a woman who saves him, and then he decides that he's going to walk what in Buddhism is called the middle path between very extreme asceticism and hedonism. Now, just to be clear, the middle path from this perspective is very disciplined from the point of view of secular Canada. But from the point of view of some of the practices that were going on in India at the time, Buddhism takes a kind of middle path in its attitude to how you treat your body. And so from a Buddhist point of view, you don't attach to the body, but you treat it with respect, you care for it. And so according to the tradition, eventually he sits in a meditative posture under a peepal tree and states, this is, I'm going to achieve enlightenment. So according to the tradition, he eventually does this, and as a result of moving through these higher and higher states of consciousness, he becomes aware of his past births. He becomes aware of how the workings of karma operate, and then he comes back into his body, and he is the enlightened one, so he's the Buddha at that point. scriptures, the Buddha then went searching for students, and he had known some men who were also ascetics, and he finds them in a deer park and he gives the first sermon. And so that statue I showed you is actually a depiction of that moment where he gives his first Dharma talk to those men, and they become his disciples. Buddhism is an extremely philosophical tradition, and it develops in all sorts of settings. There's Zen philosophy, there's different forms of Mahayana philosophies. So I'm going to just highlight the key aspects of the philosophy that I think are relevant for this course and that are true for all of the sects, regardless of whether they're Mahayana, Theravada, or Vajrayana. So the first teaching is the Four Noble Truths. And so this is at the very heart of Buddhism and its understanding of reality. So the first noble truth is that suffering is inevitable for all living beings. So the word in Pali is related to Sanskrit. It's the liturgical language of early Buddhism. And so he states that all life is dukkha, or it's usually translated into English as suffering or unsatisfactory. So Buddhism is sometimes accused of being pessimistic, and it could be looked at that way, but from a Buddhist point of view, it's to live without illusion that suffering comes into all human life. And that links us back to the foresights, that he has that realization that even though he's a young, wealthy man, he too will be eventually subject to suffering. The second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is desire or craving, tanha. So the Buddha's insight then, and this is central to Buddhism, is the idea that what causes our suffering is our desire. It's our desire for various things, and when we don't get them, we're frustrated. And so he's diagnosing the problem, and it's often the Buddha is referred to as the great physician because he's diagnosing the problems of humanity. So the second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is desire. The third noble truth is that in order to end suffering, one must end all craving or desire. So this is very logical, the way he works through this, the cause of it, and then how to deal with it. And so how do you go about doing that? Because human beings, we're completely subject to desire and craving. The fourth noble truth is the way to do this is through the Eightfold Path. So there's a lot of numbers here. This is partly because Buddhism was, as in early Hinduism, was an oral tradition. It was memorized, and monks still memorize, and nuns memorize huge amounts of text. And so it's a way to remember when you have a numbering system. I want to look now at the Noble Eightfold Path, and so you'll remember that in yoga, there are the 8 limbs of yoga, so this is very common in the teachings of both Buddhism and Hinduism. And so we begin with right view, which is the beginning of the path, and it simply means to see and understand things as they really are, which would mean to believe the Four Noble Truths, and to see things as they are without illusions. So this would mean, for instance, to grasp the impermanent and imperfect nature of worldly objects and ideas, and to understand the laws of karma. So right thought and right speech. So again, similar idea, the idea of controlling of thought and purifying thought. And so it's very important within Buddhism. The mind is absolutely at the center, and we're going to be looking at that as we move along. It's often been said that Buddhism is it's really a kind of psychology. I think that's an overstatement, and that's trying to shoehorn it into a Western category, but certainly psychology is very important within Buddhism, what we would call psychology. Number 3, right speech. This again is very similar to what we find in yoga, the idea that how we use our speech is very important. So it isn't just that we don't harm people physically, that we also don't, for instance, slander people or gossip, these kind of misuses of speech. Number 4, right conduct, acting morally and ethically. Number 5, right livelihood. So this one is very interesting. I haven't seen this in any other religious tradition, and it's the idea that what you do for a living can't be bracketed out of your morality. So at the time that this was developed, any livelihood that caused harm to others would be considered improper, and so not conducive to a Buddhist life. So number 6, right effort. So the idea of having to make actual committed effort. And so if you remember that idea from yoga virya, so that this isn't some lukewarm activity, it takes a great deal of commitment and energy. The last 2 are right mindfulness and right meditation. And as with yoga, it moves from these more ethical attitudes to meditative practice. Now, in early Buddhism, typically only monks and nuns would practice meditation. We've seen a real change in that in the contemporary period, beginning in the late 19th century, where lay people became more involved in practicing meditation. But certainly it's seen as being very challenging. And so you have to develop all these other aspects before you can really move into those higher meditative states. Image is a close-up of a Buddhist statue in which the Buddha is giving the earth-touching gesture or mudra, and this is the moment in which he says that he's taking the earth as witness to the fact that he has become enlightened and that this will be his last rebirth. So it's very important to note that the goal of Buddhism is to move out of the cycle of samsara, which is that endless cycle of birth, death, rebirth. So belief in reincarnation is shared with Hinduism. So the only way out of that endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is through nirvana, the achievement of nirvana or enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition. And key to that is the human mind. A section of the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is the oldest strata of the scripture in the Buddhist tradition. As I said, it would have been originally in Pali, and it really gets at the heart of the tradition, the most basic teachings of the tradition. So I want to look at it. So it states, if by an impure mind one speaks and acts, then suffering follows the mind as a cartwheel follows the footprint of an ox. So this idea that if we're acting when our mind is impure, then our actions will be incorrect. So Buddhism always takes us back to the mind and purification of the mind, because once the mind is pure, how one speaks and how one acts will be changed automatically. The mind is the source of all mental states. Mind is their leader, and they are made by the mind. If by a pure mind one speaks and acts, then happiness follows the mind like a shadow. So again, this idea that if we speak from that purity of mind, then happiness will follow, and also lack of illusion and awareness. And so that's, of course, that's very easy to say, but attaining to a pure mind is what Buddhist practice is all about, and it's very challenging. When looking at the Dhammapada, I think you can see why it's considered to be a kind of spiritual gem for the whole world. And so if you are interested in Buddhism, it's a very good place to start. If you get a good translation of the Dhammapada, it gives you a very good sense of the Buddhist tradition. So, I was abused, I was beaten, I was hurt, I was robbed. Those who dwell excessively on such thoughts never get out of their hating state of mind. In this world, hatreds are never ended by more hatred. Hatreds are only ended by loving kindness. This is an eternal dharma. Okay, so this idea, again, that the mind, what we ruminate on, what we go over and over again in our head, establishes our sense of identity. So in more contemporary language, we would say this is a kind of victim attitude of these things have happened to me, and they weren't in my power. And so these states of mind can lead to things like anger and hatred. And so from a Buddhist point of view, they would refer to this as the poisons of the mind. And so all of these practices, particularly meditation, are about removing the poisons of the mind. And so he goes on to say, in this world, hatreds are never ended by more hating. So again, this will be familiar to anybody who's aware of many of the world's spiritual traditions, this idea that despite what may have happened to us, to act out of hatred is never going to end this cycle. And so hatreds are only ended by loving kindness. This is an eternal dharma. So this is absolutely at the heart of Buddhism, this idea that you always move towards other living beings with loving kindness, and that is an eternal teaching for all people over time. And again, we may all believe in this and agree with this, but it's very difficult in practice, as everybody knows. If somebody has been mistreated by somebody, it's very difficult to approach them in this way. And so Buddhism recognizes that this is a process over many lifetimes of purifying the mind to be able to change how your mind is working. The Dhammapada goes on to talk about what is necessary to achieve nirvana, to achieve enlightenment. And so it states, one who dwells on personal gratification, overindulges in the senses, overeats, is indolent and lazy, that person is overthrown by Mara like an old weak tree in a windstorm. So Mara in Buddhism is kind of the tempter who, there's a story in which the Buddha is tempted by Mara so that he will not become enlightenment and he'll become attached to things like power and sexuality. So we can see this very ascetic idea that we have to work to not be tempted through our senses to things like overeating, laziness, and so on. And so it's very clear that idea that this takes a lot of effort to overcome this. Otherwise, we're overcome like a weak tree in a windstorm. One who dwells in meditation on the bodily impurities, keeps the sense under control, eats moderately, has faith and disciplined energy, that person stands against Mara like a mountain. So again, that idea of these are the qualities that are necessary in order to achieve nirvana is meditation on the bodily impurities, keeping the senses under control, and eating moderately, and having faith and disciplined energy are all necessary to achieving the ultimate goal of nirvana.